Hi everyone. In this video today we're going to do a quick overview of labeling theory and how it's relevant in the field of criminology and criminal justice, and explaining deviance and delinquent behavior and criminality, right? So the main topics we're going to cover today in this video is labeling theory in and of itself. Just going to provide a quick definition of it and what it involves. Talk about primary deviance, secondary deviance, and kind of depict the causal model, how it's theorized to occur. So this is really explaining the process, the process of how one becomes involved into uh, a deviant or delinquent based on a label that may or may not be attached to that individual. All right, and then going to wrap up the video just quickly talking about testing the theory. This is one of the more difficult theories to test and analyze in an empirical fashion. Nevertheless, labeling theory. So it's really a sequential theory, right? It focuses on the process that underlies uh, criminalization. So some might kind of throw labeling theory into a critical criminology or a critical take because it's really looking at how society influences crime. Okay, how it motivates and pushes individuals to become involved in criminal activities to some degree. It's not necessarily like that the individual learns the behavior or there's a biological predisposition or there's no control for that individual. Just kind of how society in and of itself is uh, responsible for the development to some degree. Okay, what labeling theory is really rooted in is rooted in the concept of the looking glass self by Cooley in 1902. So what the looking glass self gets at, it involves the notion that, you can be, I am what I am, right? That's what Popeye would say. I am what I am. But that's not necessarily true, okay? Given on the context on where you go, who you interact with, and what you do, you know, people tend to base themselves on how they feel others view them. So I portray myself in a manner that I ex I believe that you expect me to portray myself as. Does that make sense? That I am who I think you think I am. So, and I'm going to conduct myself accordingly. So if I think you think I'm this exceptional person, I'm going to convey that to the highest standard that I can, right? If I think that you think I'm a terrible person, well, I might fulfill that role too. So that's kind of the notion of the looking glass self. So people don't really act who they are independently. They are acting in a manner which they believe others think they should be acting, essentially, is kind of what it gets at. And there's perhaps a lot of truth to that based on different social contexts, right, and how you operate. You think about your supervisor, or you're going to a job interview, or you're going to a school or a new school and your classmates or whatever, your family, you're not necessarily always free to act how you want to be. Maybe if you're a complete sociopath, you might be, somewhat might stay. But otherwise, generally there's some limitations on what you'll do and how you'll convey yourself because there's a perception that from yourself that others going to think how you should be responding and reacting, whether it's true or not. And that doesn't really even matter because a lot of times how we portray ourselves to other people isn't necessarily what other people expect of you and how you are expected to be portrayed. So that in and of itself is a niche and a little conflict. But regardless, that's what the looking glass self is. I'm not who I am. I am what I think you think I am, all right? And that's how I will conduct myself accordingly, all right? So labeling theory, in a nutshell, it assumes that when an individual engages in deviance, they can be labeled. So if a child or youth or adolescent goes and gets involved in some delinquent activities, say going stealing something out of the store, stealing candy, maybe they tried marijuana or something like that, uh, then once society recognizes that this individual is engaged in that deviant or delinquent activity, then a label can be applied to that individual, right? And once that individual knows, like, hey, well, these people think I'm a junkie, right? Or they think I'm a thief. Well, it kind of like separates you and it isolates you and it removes you from normal society to some degree, right? And you internalize that label perhaps. And then what's going to stop the individual from fulfilling that role in the future? Because that's what people expect me to do, right? People expect me to go steal cars or go steal candy down the store or go do drugs or something like that, right? Or get in fights. So the segregation, it creates this class of outsiders. There's a book titled The Outsiders. It kind of gets into this to some degree, right? Or social outcast, right? It happens when you're removed from normative society in your mind to some degree, and then you internalize this label and become a social outcast. And as a result, people tend to go find other groups that they'll fit in with, and that don't really care about that label, that perhaps themselves are labeled as such or believe that they are labeled as such. And thus is the labeling process in a nutshell. I know it's very philosophical and kind of esoteric to some degree. It's kind of might be a little difficult to grasp, but Lemur in 1951 developed two typologies, right? The secondary and primary and secondary type of deviant acts is what he propagated. So primary deviance, this is right the first, the primary initial. It occurs when an individual violates social norms without viewing themselves as being involved in a deviant social role, right? So you got to start somewhere. You got to smoke weed first one time. You got to steal something out of the store first at one time. You got to get in a fight at one point in time, right? The first one before it snowballs, right? What he argued is, what he suggests is that the initial primary deviance can stem from a number of sources, right? Psychological, genetic, sociological factors, any type of outside influences or internalized influences might be responsible for the behavior. So what happens after the primary deviance and how society responds to that individual is considered to be a very important point in perhaps stopping the behavior from progressing. So if society doesn't recognize that the kid stole candy or was out there smoking marijuana, maybe their parents stopped them from it and corrected that behavior and changed that behavior, then it might not evolve into something furthermore. All right, but if society does recognize that, then it lends itself to the notion of secondary deviance. Okay, this is a deviant act that results from a change in self-concept brought about by a labeling process. So if society, whatever society is, a group, the neighborhood, a community, recognizes this the individual is out there smoking marijuana or stealing candy out of the store, um, the community becomes aware, then they attach that label. They assign a label to the individual. Oh, Tommy's a little thief. He's out there stealing stuff out of the corner store. Or, Susie May, she's over there smoking marijuana. You can't go hang out with her. Nobody should be hanging out with her. So then the community becomes aware and they kind of assign that role, and then the kid will hear that. Well, my parents won't let me hang out with you. You're smoking all these drugs and doing this, that, and the other and stealing things. So the individual may turn to more deviance than would otherwise happen as a result of the label. So old Bobby Joe doesn't care anymore, right? Well, they already think I'm a thief. I'm a small, go steal some more stuff, right? Or they already think I'm doing all these drugs. Might as well continue to do some more, right? So this is kind of the causal process, kind of how it all plays out. So you have primary deviance. So these are the acts that might occur without the individual knowing or recognizing that they're even deviant or delinquent in the first place, or were being influenced by the label, essentially. So no label is attached if it doesn't recognized, and perhaps a lot of people fall into this label, right, or fall into this avenue, right? Because most of y'all, right, few people haven't committed a delinquent or deviant act in this world that would be considered, if they were caught or observed by the wrong individuals, where it would have been made such a big issue, then you would have perhaps been assigned a label. But generally this occurs. No labels attached. Maybe the individual gets corrected by their parents or a friend or somebody else and say, hey, don't do that type of stuff. Don't do those drugs. What are you doing? You're an idiot. And then they stop, right? Or no labels really attached, and they don't necessarily have a justification to move on to secondary deviation. But when that primary deviance is recognized, and a label is attached by the community, by a neighborhood, by a group, by society. What this does, it alters an individual's self-concept. It does all three of these things at once simultaneously. It alters an individual's self-concept. Well, instead of thinking about what, happy-go-lucky, all of a sudden, all these people that I went to school with or go to school with think I'm a bad person and that I steal things, that I'm doing these drugs and all this type of stuff. That changes, that alters an individual's perception of themselves. Also, what it does, it changes their opportunity structure. Right? When the community is aware, when the neighborhood's aware, when parents are aware that, oh, you know, Tommy over there is all doing all these drugs. Well, they can't hang out with my kids anymore. You can't go to the park with them. You can't go over to their house, and that's gonna snowball a lot of things, right? It changes opportunity structure. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, good or bad or anything. It just changes, and it reduces the normative opportunities for a lot of individuals. Uh, and what that in turn does is influences individuals to turn, as a result of the application of a label, to a subculture or a deviant subculture, perhaps a gang or something like that, or under other individuals who've been outcasted, all right, been outcasted from normative society to some degree, right? These deviant subcultures, where youth have already been cast aside to some degree, and they're involved in whatever, doing drugs, stealing stuff, and whatever. And as a result, these are the kids I can go hang out with. These are folks I can go hang out with. And what that does is it influences, it interacts with differential association, hanging out in a deviant subculture. So differential association is a social learning theory. Go back to one of the previous videos and look at social learning theory. It talks about the process of learning. We learn from definitions favorable to crime and all these different processes associated with it. So hanging out with people that are out there smoking marijuana is going to teach you other ways to do it. Maybe get involved into other drugs, heroin or cocaine or crack or methamphetamine or all these other types of things. And at the same time, maybe learn how to steal and break into cars and rob stores and all these good things. And that's going to interact with your self-concept because you're hanging out with these subcultures. You're learning more delinquent activity or deviant activity, and that's going to they're going to work both ways. It's going to continually influence one's self-concept about themselves, right? Their perceptions of themselves and who they are and who they hang out with. And in the end of the day, all this continues down the road to secondary deviation, more deviance. That's a result as of being labeled. Okay, so this is kind of the causal process, and that leads me to the next topic, really testing this theory. All right, this is Lemert's perspective on it because it talks about primary and secondary deviance or deviation. Right, a lot of these concepts are difficult to assess. What is a label? What is a self-concept? In trying to assess empirically and understand the process. So labeling theory in and of itself is perhaps one of the most difficult crime theories to empirically test, to quantitatively test. It's largely due to the conceptualization of key terms, key concepts, what constitutes labeling, how is it defined, when is it attached, how can I assess when a label isn't attached. And there's not like an overt process that a youth will know, that an individual knows. All right, it's a process. It's a time process, right? Some studies I've looked at, they're qualitative in nature, but it involves going to courthouses, youth making their initial appearance in front of a, and in that's a formal recognition, right? The juvenile justice system recognizes this youth as being delinquent, right? And that's still tricky even then, all right? Because it doesn't necessarily involve the exact point when the label pretty much sets in for an individual, okay? On that note, that's kind of what the juvenile justice system in this country is predicated on, this notion, right? That's why there's delinquents as opposed to criminals, right? You're adjudicated instead of found guilty, and all these different terminologies, completely different system that comes in the early 1900s, right? In the early 1920s, pretty much before 1900s, there was no such thing as a juvenile, right? And these are statutorily defined. They're defined by the state what a juvenile is, and that's a concept in and of itself. From state to state, it could be 16, 17, or 18 years of age, depending on what state you are in within the United States. All right, so beyond that tangent, it's difficult to answer because label is intangible. It's not easily identifiable. The theory is lacking a formal definition of labeling, and that's one of the biggest criticisms of this theory. It's one of the least empirically tested and validated, but it's certainly interesting, and a lot of qualitative research does address. There are some good qualitative research articles out there that address labeling theory, but um, and just to recap everything, we kind of talked briefly about labeling theory. It's the process of society judging an individual and placing a label on an individual, and thus that individual pretty much fulfilling, being identified as delinquent or criminal, and then the individual being reduced to opportunities and all these other things that come along with it, and exposure to subcultures that are welcoming to that individual, probably extends the process. So it's all rooted in the looking glass self, that I am not who I am. I am what I think you think I am. All right, so that's kind of the idea that underlies it. Primary deviance is deviance that occurs without the individual having a label attached. Perhaps they don't know what's wrong. It could be psychological. It could be a biological or sociological factor that's responsible for it. Secondary deviance is deviant acts or delinquent acts or criminal acts that occur after being labeled, after the label sets into an individual. Talk real briefly about the causal model and testing the theory, and it's kind of a difficult theory to test. So hopefully this video helps you guys out, and y'all take care now.